Welcome to the Irish Revolution. This is part 2 of the Easter Rising and its aftermath. In the last episode, we left Ireland on the brink of civil war, with rising tension, only to be relieved by the outbreak of the Great War in Europe. In this episode, we'll focus on two of the major personalities of the Easter Rising: Padraig Pearse, the romantic nationalist, and also a few words on James Connolly, the socialist. But first, please indulge me with a wee poem that I feel epitomises the whole story. It's called The Mother. I do not grudge them, Lord, I do not grudge, my two strong sons that I have seen go out, to break their strength and die, they and a few, in bloody protest for a glorious thing. They shall be spoken of among their people, the generations shall remember them, and call them blessed. But I will speak their names to my own heart, in the long nights, the little names that were familiar once, round my dead hearth. Lord, thou art hard on mothers, we suffer in their coming and their going, and though I grudge them not, I weary of the long sorrow, and yet I have my joy. My sons were faithful, and they fought. Padraig Pearse. There is that fella again, Padraig Pearse, often called Patrick Pearse. Without Pearse, would there have even been a rising? Yes, probably, but he certainly put his own spin on things. In the words of the historian Fergal McGarry, Pearse was intense, unworldly, undeniably odd. Although a great orator and stirring writer, he was socially awkward and shy. Many volunteers testified years later that spending time with Pearse was otherworldly, and he was often lost in thought. Pearse was an educationalist, poet, and a Gaelic League enthusiast who ran a secondary school for boys in South Dublin called St Enda's. He was in perpetual financial trouble trying to finance the school, and this coloured much of his later intense life, trying to balance the duties of a revolutionary and an educator. He was far ahead of his time with his educational methods. As something of an educationalist myself, it's worthwhile studying his language teaching techniques, a forerunner of the communicative learning method. He also wrote drama with an emphasis on Ireland's ancient mythic past. I'm not going to talk about his sexuality. I don't need that kind of attention, to be honest with you. People can read Ruth Dudley Edwards if they want to see what all the fuss is about. I'm not going to touch it with a 20-foot barge pole. Pearse was for a long time known as a Home Rule advocate, but something changed around this time and he radicalised. Indeed, he was welcomed into the IRB quite late, as Tom Clark, the de facto leader of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, was somewhat suspicious of his once relatively moderate leanings. He took an interest in Na Fianna, a nationalist youth organisation set up by Bulmer Hobson and Constance Markovich in 1909. He allowed them to train in the grounds of St Enda's. A passionate and motivated bunch, the older ones became Irish volunteers in 1913, and they provided many of the rebels in 1916, such as 15-year-old Sean Healy, who died during Easter week. Pearse believed that the Fianna kept the military spirit of Ireland alive, and that without them the volunteers would never have arisen in 1913. Without context, reading some of his writings can be rather, terrifying, especially in our less militaristic age. But condemning Pearse, as many 21st century Irish people like to do, is about as useful as an American condemning Thomas Jefferson for saying, "The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants." Each statement belongs in its time and deserves to be studied on its own merits. Jefferson was absorbed in the revolutionary ferment of that age, and Pearse in his. I'm not here to say whether it was correct or right. It's an understandable impulse considering the history of Ireland and the troubles and all the violence. But really, it's not fair to Pearse, and it's not fair to Irish history to judge him for the campaign of the Provisional IRA in the 70s, 80s and 90s. In the last episode, I mentioned Pearse's article in An Claidheamh Solaois on the 8th of November 1913 in response to Owen MacNeill praising the Ulster men for forming the Ulster Volunteers. Pearse wrote then that he was glad that the Orange men had armed, because it was a goodly thing to see arms in Irish hands. He also wrote that we must accustom ourselves to the thought of arms, to the sight of arms, to the use of arms. We may make some mistakes in the beginning and shoot the wrong people, but bloodshed is a cleansing and sanctifying thing, and the nation which regards it as a final horror has lost its manhood. There are many things more horrible than bloodshed, and slavery is one of them. This was to provide the basic framework for all Irish Republicans, for good or for ill, for generations to come. In an article he published for the separatist Spark magazine in December 1915, Pearse celebrated the fact that millions of men across Europe were now dying for their countries. Seeing heroism in this, he wrote, "It is good for the world that such things should be done. The old heart of the earth needed to be warmed with the red wine of the battlefields. Such august homage was never before offered to God as this, the homage of millions of lives given gladly for love of country. To put this in context, he also said that war was a terrible thing, and that the current war in Europe was the most terrible war. However, in other writings he did say that there were far worse things than bloodshed, exploitation of workers by plutocrats in Britain, spiritual decline in France, national enslavement by the Poles in Russia, and the history of the Irish, of course. And in the words of the historian Just Augustine, sorry to all Dutch people for that pronunciation by the way, if this war could put an end to these wrongs by bringing a workers' revolution to England, making the French return to their altars, and free the Poles and the Irish, then all the terrible suffering would have been worthwhile. In Pearse's defence, this kind of rhetoric was increasingly popular in an increasingly nationalistic Europe among poets and writers. He got caught up in a wave of romantic nationalism and perhaps revelled in his unofficial role as chief propagandist for revolution. Clearly, Pearse fused all of this with a type of militant Catholicism, embodying Ireland and the Gael as Jesus on the cross, and later he imagined the blood sacrifice of Easter 1916 as the suffering of Jesus whose death would resurrect Ireland. 1916 would join the pantheon of sacred years, 1798, 1803, etc. He expected the rebellion to fail, he expected to die, he believed that his death and the death of the others would spur the nation to republican virtue. His rhetoric and his writings must be put in the context of the time. Bonar Law, the leader of the Conservatives, was effectively urging Northern Unionists to rebellion. British officers were refusing orders to enforce the law. Home Rule, already an unsatisfactory compromise with its modest legislative autonomy and recognition of partition, was not necessarily something guaranteed, although some historians might well challenge that statement. This was a febrile time and violence was in the air. The historian Joseph Lee wrote, Pearse's elaboration of the moral right to rebellion can only be understood as a response to the Orange appeal to violence and the Home Rule insistence that nationalists should refuse to take any similar steps and rely instead on the Liberal government's assurances that it would not tolerate Unionist defiance of Parliament. He viewed politics in moral terms. To quote the historian Charles Townshend, his central idea was that of the blood sacrifice, insurrection not merely as a tactical device but as an ethical affirmation. Violence came for him to represent national political redemption. When Irish people learn about the Easter Rising at school, one of the main events that gets emphasised in the run-up to it is the funeral of Jeremiah O'Donovan Rossa, a prominent American-based Fenian who led a dynamite campaign against the British. The IRB were eager to exploit his funeral for propaganda purposes, a tradition of Republican funerals that would be familiar to anyone who lived through the Troubles in Northern Ireland. On August 1st, 1915, Pearse gave his funeral oration with words that have lived through the ages. They think that they have pacified Ireland. They think that they have purchased half of us and intimidated the other half. They think that they have foreseen everything, think that they have provided against everything, but the fools, the fools, the fools. They have left us our Fenian dead, and while Ireland holds these graves, Ireland unfree shall never be at peace. The impact of this oration was tremendous. And it was shortly after this that the military committee took the decision to launch a rebellion within the next 6 months. How much was it down to Pearse? Who can say, really? His importance to the Irish state right up until the 60s was enormous. Indeed, a common refrain towards somebody seen as being disrespectful or dishonest in some way, at least in politics, was, Pearse will be ashamed of you. To say that Pearse was a proto-fascist, a term that gets knocked around nowadays, is not correct or fair. He was a modernising influence. Just look at his educational methods and ideas. He was admired in a profound way by his students, and he was extremely progressive for his era. His rhetoric was hot, but he lived in a turbulent age. Pearse also seemed to embrace a loose, unformed kind of socialism around this time too, which should have brought him close to James Connolly, the famous trade unionist and socialist figure. Yet Connolly wrote in response to the Red Wine of the Battlefield article that we mentioned earlier, "No, we do not think the old heart of the earth needs to be warmed with the red wine of millions of lives. We think anyone who does is a blithering idiot. We are sick of such teaching, and the world is sick of such teaching." Connolly was in control of the Irish Citizen Army, a small Dublin-based group set up during the Dublin lockout of 1913. Jim Larkin led the Irish Transport and General Workers Union, ITGWU for short, during this industrial dispute, but after it ended he went to America. He was replaced by James Connolly, a Scot from Edinburgh born to Irish parents, who went on to become a celebrated socialist hero. Connolly, at first anyway, regarded the Irish volunteers as bourgeois and their leadership as bourgeois, and generally stayed aloof from them. He preferred his ideologically pure citizens' army and to quote Charles Townshend, they made no effort to dilute its revolutionary posture in order to attract wider support. Connolly was dismayed by the Great War, seeing the working classes of Europe killing each other for the benefit of their masters, to quote the man himself. In the words of the historian Joseph Lee, Connolly was a cantankerous man. He had a genius, even in the faction-ridden company he kept, for quarrelsomeness. He was also, by some considerable distance, the most remarkable man of his generation in Irish politics. There was even talk of Connolly going out on his own with the Citizens' Army to launch their own little rebellion. He was finally convinced to cooperate with the Volunteers and the IRB and would participate in the attack in Easter 1916 as a united front, and he as a commandant of the Dublin Brigade. It was from Connolly where the 1916 leaders got the idea, the rather stupid idea, that the British would never use artillery on a private property in Dublin. Connolly told Bulmer Hobson, who was somewhat sceptical of the need for a rebellion, that the working class was always revolutionary, that Ireland was a powder magazine, and that what was necessary was for someone to apply the match. I replied that if he must talk in metaphors, Ireland was a wet bog, and that the match would fall into a puddle. Connolly may have secretly thought the same. Indeed, on Easter Monday he remarked that, quote, "We're going out to get slaughtered," end quote. And when asked if there was any hope for success, he replied, quote, "None whatever," end quote. Thanks for watching. I know I said that this episode would focus more on the plans for the Rising. Well, in the end, that will actually take place in the next one. Pearse and Connolly were such gigantic figures that they really needed their own episode. If you've got something to say about either of them, why not say so in the comments? I for one feel that Connolly probably deserved a bit more time than he got. He is a huge figure, an interesting man, but I wanted the main focus to be on Pearse and his romantic nationalism, for it was his ideas that were to last in Ireland, not Connolly's socialism. If you like this, please like my video, that helps people find me. Obviously subscribe too. You can follow me on Twitter and Facebook. I don't have that many followers yet, so that would be cool. Thanks so much for watching, and see you in a few weeks.